Well now, pull up a chair. The name's Earl McKenna. The salt's etched itself into the lines on my face, and my hands are more leather than skin, but the memories, they're still clear as a calm morning on the water. Some stories are about the one that got away, the big catch that tests a man. But the ones that stick with you, the ones that haunt the quiet hours before dawn, they ain't about. They're about the things you find in the deep, dark places you were never meant to look. Our town, Port Blossom, was never more than a small notch carved into the coast where the gray river met the sea. For generations, we lived by the rhythm of the tides and silver pulse of the fish that ran up that river to spawn. The salmon, the shad, the sturgeon, they were our bloodline, our currency, our calendar. And watching over it all was the dam. The old-timers just called it the Gray Dike. It wasn't just a structure. It was fact of life, like the sunrise. Our grandfathers' generation had poured their sweat and blood into that mountain of concrete, a monument to taming the wild surges of the river and harnessing its power. It stood there, a silent gray wall stretching from one side of the valley to the other, its massive face streaked with decades of rain and algae, looking more like a natural cliff than anything made by man. We'd grown up in its shadow, fished its spillway, and listened to the steady hum of its turbines turning water into light. It was just there, until it started to kill the river. It began subtly. A few lean seasons we blamed on overfishing offshore, or a change in the currents. But then, lean turned to bone thin. The great salmon runs that used to choke the river, turning the water into a writhing mass of silver and red, dwindled to a pale ghost of their former glory. The shad disappeared altogether. Docks that were once a bustle of activity, slick with fish scales and loud with the shouts of men, grew quiet and dry. The worry started as a whisper in the taverns and became a loud, desperate prayer in the church on Sunday. The government sent men in clean boots and pressed shirts, engineers, they called themselves. They came with clipboards and instruments that measured things we couldn't see. After a week of tapping on metal and staring at blueprints, they gave us their answer. It was the turbine. The old Francis turbines, they said, were outdated. The pressure differential and the cavitation were killing the fish as they tried to navigate the ladders. It made a kind of sense. The dam was old. Technology had moved on. They promised studies, committees, and maybe in a few years, a refurbishment project. But their explanation didn't sit right, not with the men who knew the water. I was young then, but I'd spent enough time on a boat with my mentor, Solomon, to learn how to read the river's story. Solomon was a man who seemed to be carved from the same weathered driftwood that littered our shores. He spoke little, but when he did, his words had the weight of stone. He taught me that you don't just look at the water, you listen to it, you feel it, you smell it. One afternoon, we found one, a big Chinook salmon, floating belly up in an eddy just downstream from the dam. The engineers would have just marked it down on their charts as one casualty, but Solomon and I, we pulled it from the water. I laid it on the damp stones of the riverbank. There wasn't a mark on it, not a single cut from a turbine blade, no sign of being battered against the concrete. Its scales were perfect, a shimmering armor of silver and sea green, but it was pale. Its gills, which should have been a vibrant, angry red, were the color of faded linen. Its eyes were cloudy, but not in the usual way. It looked drained, as if its very life force had been leached out of it, leaving behind a perfectly formed but empty shell. "Turbines don't do that, Earl," Solomon said, his voice a low rumble like stones shifting at the bottom of the river. "Turbines shred. They tear. This is something else." That was when I started to notice the other thing, the things the men with clipboards would never see because they never stayed past sundown. I'd be out on the water late, checking my lines in the twilight, and I'd hear it, a hum, It wasn't the steady, mechanical drone of the generators in the powerhouse. That sound was a part of our lives, the background noise of our town. This was different. It was lower, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the concrete itself. It wasn't it would rise and fall, slow, intermittent pulse, like a massive heart beating in its sleep. I'd feel it more than hear it, a vibration coming up through the hull of my boat, through the soles of my boots. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I mentioned it to Solomon one evening as we mended nets. He just nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the gray wall of the dam, turning a deep purple in the dying light. I've heard it. Feels like a toothache in the jaw of the world. Then came the vibration, not just on the water, but on land. Some nights, when the whole town was still, and the only sound was the distant call of a foghorn out at sea, I'd feel it in my little house, a faint, deep shudder that ran through the floorboards. It was so subtle at first, I thought I was imagining it, but it kept happening, a tremor that lasted only a moment, a deep, resonant shudder that had nothing to do with the trains on the far side of the county or the settling of an old house. It felt ancient. It felt like the earth itself was shifting uneasily in its sleep, and it always seemed to come from the direction of the dam, the final piece of the puzzle, the one that convinced me we were looking at the wrong kind of monster. Was the animal. Nature has a way of knowing things man has forgotten. The gulls, usually a screaming, greedy cloud over any potential meal, would circle the waters downstream, but they never landed on the stretch right at the base of the dam. Herons and egrets, who would patiently stalk the shallows for hours, kept a clear and defined distance. Even the otters, the most playful and fearless creatures on the river, gave that patch of water a wide berth. It was as if there was an invisible line drawn in the water, a dead zone that only the wildlife could see. They could feel something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The town's desperation was turning ugly. Men were selling their boats for pennies on the dollar. Families who had lived off the river for 100 years were packing up and heading inland to look for work in factories. The clean-shirted engineers came back one last time. We tried to tell them. Solomon, in his quiet, steady way, spoke of the pale fish. I tried to explain the hum, the vibration. A few other old-timers backed us up, talking about how the river just felt sick. They smiled those polite, dismissive smiles. They talked about auditory pareidolia and minor seismic settling. They said our fears were understandable, the product of economic anxiety. They called it superstition. They looked at the dam and saw a masterpiece of engineering. Solomon and I looked at it and saw a tombstone. That evening, Solomon and I took my skiff out and just drifted, letting the current carry us slowly towards the vast curved wall of concrete. The sun was setting, painting the sky violent shades of orange and red that reflected off the dam's impact. The hum was there, a little stronger now in the quiet air, a deep, resonant note that seemed to sink right into your bones. "They're not going to do anything, are they, Saul?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on the dam, on the dark water swirling at its base. "Men like that," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "only believe what their numbers tell them. They've forgotten how to listen." He finally turned to me, his old eyes dark and serious. "The answer isn't in their blueprints, Earl. The sickness isn't in the machines. It's in the stone. And whatever it is, it's waking up." I looked at that wall of concrete, a structure I had known my entire life, and for the first time, I felt a dread so cold and so deep. It felt like I had swallowed a mouthful of icy river water. He was right. We were on our own, and if we wanted answers, we were going to have to go find them in the dark. Desperation, a powerful fuel. It'll make a man do things his saner self would call foolish. And Port Blossom was running on nothing but desperation. The store shelves were getting thinner, the for sale signs were multiplying like mushrooms after a rain, and the quiet anger in the tavern was starting to simmer a dangerous heat. Solomon and I knew that waiting for some government committee to act was like waiting for the tide to turn back time. We needed proof, something more than pale fish and a feeling in our bones. That's where Ben came in. Ben was younger than me, but built like a draft horse and about as stubborn. He'd worked summers on the dam's construction crews doing repairs, and he knew the structure's public face better than anyone. More importantly, he believed us. He'd felt the tremors in his own home, and he'd lost his boat and his livelihood just like everyone else. When I told him and Solomon my idea, a reckless, illegal trip to the base of the dam at night, he didn't hesitate. His knuckles went white as he gripped the table. "Whatever's killing this river," he said, his voice low and tight, "it's got to have a mouth. We just have to find it." We set out 3 nights later, when the moon was a sliver and a thick coastal fog was rolling in, a gift from the sea that would hide us from any curious eye. We didn't use an outboard motor. The sound would carry for miles over the still water. Instead, we took my old wooden dory, the one I used for trapping crab. Ben and I manned the oars, dipping them into the black water as gently as we could, trying to make no sound, the soft dip and pull. Solomon sat in the stern, a silent helmsman, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, where the dam should be. The closer we got, the more the world seemed to fall away. The sounds of the town faded behind us, swallowed by the fog. The air grew cold, heavy with the smell of wet stone and something else, a faint, coppery scent like old blood, and the hum. It was no longer just a feeling in our feet. It was a tangible presence in the air, a deep, resonant vibration that made my teeth ache. The fog swirled around us, and then a shape began to resolve itself out of the gray mist. It didn't look like a wall anymore. Looming over us, disappearing into the clouds, the gray dike looked like the jawbone of some colossal dead god. The sheer scale of it, seen from a tiny boat, very feet, was enough to make your soul. The water here was unnaturally still, dark and glassy, reflecting the few stars that managed to pierce the fog. Ben pointed with his chin. "There," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "the old access vents for the sluiceway maintenance. The plans say they were sealed up in the '50s. We paddled towards a series of arches set deep into the concrete base just above the waterline. Most were indeed sealed with newer, smoother concrete, but one, tucked away in the deepest shadow, looked different. There was a dark, jagged line around it. We nudged the dory closer, the hull scraping against the rough, algae-slicked wall. It wasn't sealed. It was an old iron door, rusted nearly solid into its frame, but a hairline crack remained. It took the 3 of us, with a crowbar Ben had brought, to groan that door open. The sound of metal screeching against rusted metal was obscenely loud, silent. It opened just enough for a man to squeeze through, revealing a maw of absolute darkness. The air that puffed out felt ancient and wrong, thick and suffocating, carrying that coppery smell, only stronger now. Solomon handed me an oil lantern. "You and Ben go," he said. "I'll keep the boat steady. Don't be heroes. If it feels wrong, you get out." Ben went first, squeezing through the gap, his boots splashing in a few inches of stagnant water. I passed him the lantern and another crowbar, then wriggled in after him. Inside, the world was reduced to the small dancing circle of light from our lamp. We were in a narrow tunnel, the arched ceiling dripping with a steady, rhythmic plink, plink, plink that echoed into the darkness ahead. The hum was overwhelming in here. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical pressure, a weight on my chest that made each breath a conscious effort. It was coming from the walls, the floor, from the very stone around us. "This tunnel isn't on any of the official schematics," Ben murmured, his voice sounding small and tight. "This is old, original construction." As our eyes adjusted, we saw it. The walls weren't bare concrete. They were covered in a growth. It wasn't moss or fungus. It was a network of pale gray-white fibers, thick as a man's thumb, spreading across the concrete like the roots of some unholy tree. They seemed to pulse with faint internal light, a sickly luminescence that waxed and waned in time with the deep hum that surrounded us. In places, the fibers coalesced into rubbery sac-like nodules that wept a thin, oily fluid. The smell was overpowering. It was the source of the copper scent, the smell of a thing that was not animal, not plant, but something dreadfully in between. We moved deeper, the lantern light throwing our shadows long and distorted against the pulsating walls. The tunnel forked. We chose the left path, which seemed to slope gently downwards, deeper into the bowels of the dam. The air grew warmer, thicker. I reached out and touched one of the fibers. It was cool and yielding like soft leather, and I felt a faint vibration travel my arm, a tiny echo thrum that filled the air. I sent back and burned. "Earl, look," Ben whispered, holding the lantern high. Ahead of us, the tunnel opened into a small, chamber-like space. In the center, a huge mass of the fibrous growth had formed a grotesque hub, plunging thick, root-like tendrils into the concrete floor and ceiling, and hanging from it, caught in the web of fibers, were fish. Dozens of them, salmon, trout, even a young sturgeon, all perfectly preserved, their scales still shimmering in the lantern light. They were pale, just like the one we'd found in the river, their bodies looking like hollowed-out sculptures. The fibers were fused to them, particularly around the gills and mouth. It was feeding on them. This thing inside the concrete was draining the life from the river. Suddenly, a sound from behind us, a scraping, grinding noise. We spun around, and my heart seized in my chest. The tunnel we'd come through was gone. A section of the ceiling, about 20 feet back, had given way. A pile of rubble and concrete dust blocked our path. "The door!" Ben coughed, his face pale in the lantern light. The vibration from opening it must have weakened it. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through me. We were trapped in the dark, in the belly of a thing we couldn't understand. We ran to the rockfall, scrabbling at the stones with our bare hands. They were too big, too heavy. Ben grabbed his crowbar and jammed it into a crack, putting all of his weight into it. The rock groaned, but didn't move. "Together!" he yelled. I found a purchase with my own crowbar, and we heaved our muscles, screaming in protest. The air was thick with dust, choking us, and then, as we put every last ounce of our strength into one desperate shove, it happened. It wasn't a tremor, it was a lurch. The entire dam, the mountain of concrete we were inside, shifted. It was a slow, deep, sickening movement, like a sleeping giant rolling over. The floor beneath our feet swayed. A deep, groaning sound through the tunnel, a sound of stressed metal and tormented stone that came from the very heart of the structure. It was the sound of a living thing shifting its weight. The fibers on the walls pulsed violently, glowing with a brighter, angrier light. The hum rose in pitch to an agonizing, soul-shaking roar. The movement dislodged the keystone of the rockfall. With a deafening crash, the pile collapsed inward, clearing a small gap at the top. We didn't wait. Ben scrambled up and through, and I followed, tearing my jacket and scraping my back on the rough concrete. We didn't look back. We ran, stumbling through the darkness of the main tunnel, our lungs burning, the roar of the dam's movement chasing us like a physical beast. We burst out of the doorway and half fell, half dove into the dory, nearly swamping it. Solomon, his face a grim mask of stone, already had an oar in the water, pushing us away from the concrete face. Ben and I grabbed the other oars, and we rowed like mad men, not away from the dam, but with the frantic energy of men escaping a tomb. Once we were 100 yards out, in the relative safety of the open water. We stopped. We turned and looked back. The fog had thinned slightly, and the gray dike stood silent and impassive under the starlight, looking exactly as it always had. The terrible living roar had subsided, replaced once again by the familiar distant drone of the turbines and the low sleeping hum. It was as if nothing had happened. But we knew our lives were now divided into two parts. The time before we knew the dam was a wall, and the time after we knew it was a cage. And we had just rattled the bar. There's a special kind of silence that follows sheer terror. It's not peaceful. It's a loud, ringing silence in your ears, where the memory of the noise is more deafening than the real thing. That was the silence in my dory as we rowed back the town dock. Our breath came in ragged gasps, the scrape of the oarlocks sounding like cannon shots in the quiet night. And speak, what was there to say? We had gone looking for a flaw in the machine and found a ghost shell, a ghost that was very much alive. We tied up the boat in the pre-dawn gloom and stumbled back to Solomon's shack. He lit a single kerosene lamp, and in its warm, flickering light, we finally looked at each other. Ben's face was smeared with dust, streaked with sweat, his eyes wide with a horrified awe. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Solomon, ever the rock, was the first to speak, his voice a low, gravelly thing. "So," he said, pouring 3 shots of cheap whiskey into chipped glasses, "the dam has a heartbeat." Ben downed his drink in one gulp, the glass clattering as he set it down. "It's not just a heartbeat, Sewell. It's alive. Those things on the walls, the fibers, they're part of it. The whole damn structure is its shell, its bones. We weren't in a tunnel. We were in its veins." The image was so stark, so horribly perfect, that I felt a wave of nausea. He was right. The way the fibers were integrated into the concrete, the way the whole mass had shifted, not like a failing structure, but like a living body. It wasn't a creature living inside the dam. The dam was the creature, or at least they had become one and the same over the long, slow decades. A monstrous concrete and flesh symbiosis that had been sleeping, feeding quietly on the river's lifeblood until something, maybe the failing of the old turbines, a change in the pressure, or just the slow passage of time, began to. We spent the rest of and into the next day sense of it, trying to form a plan. But how do you fight a mountain? Who do you tell? "Hello, Sheriff. The reason the fish are gone is because the dam is a 50-year-old leviathan that's drinking them. We'd be locked up in the state asylum before lunchtime." Our dilemma was solved for us. The news came down from the Capitol 2 days later, delivered by the same clean-shirted engineers who had dismissed us. Their instruments had detected a significant blockage, what they called a silt and debris concretion, near the main intake for turbine number 3. It was impeding the flow of water, causing the vibrations they had finally deigned to notice. Their solution was simple, direct, and to the 3 of us, apocalyptic. They were going to use controlled explosive charges to clear the blockage. The town, ignorant of the truth, celebrated. It was action. It was a solution. They thought this would be the cure for the river's sickness. For Ben, Solomon, and me, it felt like a death sentence. We knew what that concretion was. It was likely the heart of the thing, the central nexus of that fibrous growth we had seen. Setting off explosives in there, it wouldn't be clearing a pipe. It would be like performing surgery with a shotgun on a creature we didn't understand. What would an ancient wounded concrete behemoth do when woken so violently? Would it shatter? Would it unleash the full force of the river on our town in its death throes? We couldn't know, but every possibility was terrifying. We had less than 48 hours. The demolition crew was already on its way. We tried to argue, to plead with the head engineer, a man named Henderson, whose face was permanently fixed in a condescending frown. We told him there was more down there than silt. He patted my shoulder and told me to leave the engineering to the experts. That night, Solomon laid out our only remaining option. It was a madman's plan, born of pure desperation. "There's one place we haven't looked," he said, pointing a gnarled finger at an old, faded blueprint of the dam he'd salvaged years ago. "The deep water intake, the main artery. If we're going to get proof, something to ignore, it'll be there. Plan was for me to go down. Solomon was too old for that kind of strain, and Ben, for all his strength, was a poor swimmer. I had spent my youth diving for salvage, and I was the only one who could handle the old Mark V diving suit Solomon had kept in his shed, a relic from the war. It was a heavy, clumsy beast of brass and canvas, but it was our only key to the depth. The detonation was scheduled for noon the next day. We set out hours before dawn. This time, there was no fog to hide us, only a cold, clear sky full of indifference. We anchored the dory directly over the spot on the chart that marked the intake. The hum was stronger than ever, a constant, deep thrum that vibrated through the hull, a warning getting into that like being bolted. Ben lowered the helmet over, and for a moment the world was just a smell. He screwed it into place, the sound echoing in the confined space. Through the small glass faceplate, I saw Solomon's worried eyes and Ben giving me a grim, determined nod. Then they started working the hand-crank air pump, and the rhythmic whoosh, thump, became my new world. I went over the side, the lid-soled boots pulling me down instant. The descent was surreal. The dark green water of the river gave way to absolute blackness. My world was the narrow beam of the waterproof lantern I carried, the sound of my own breathing, and the steady pulse of air coming down the line. I felt the immense, crushing pressure of the water building around me, a constant, heavy hand on every inch of my body. The hum of the dam was all-encompassing now, a physical force that resonated in my cavity. My boots hit the bottom with a soft thud, kicking up a cloud of silt that swirled in my light. I was at the base of the dam. I shuffled forward, leaning against the current, dragging the heavy air hose behind me. Then I saw it. The intake. It was a massive, grated opening, big enough to swallow a small car, set into the concrete, and it was almost completely choked. But it wasn't silt debris. It was a writhing, pulsating mass of those same pale, luminescent fibers, 1,000 times thicker and more dense than what we'd seen in the tunnel. They had formed a kind of living filter over the grate, and through the gaps in the grate, in the darkness of the intake tunnel beyond, I saw movement. I moved closer, my heart pounding in time with the air pump. I angled my lantern, pushing the beam of light past the grate. For a moment, I saw nothing, swirling inner dark. Then something vast, pale, drifted into the light. It wasn't anything I could name. It was a shape, a formless, organic mass that seemed to be the source of the fibers, the core of the creature itself. And embedded in its pale, translucent flesh, like dark, dead eyes, were the skeletal remains of countless fish. The light seemed to disturb it. The entire mass inside the tunnel recoiled slowly, and the hum intensified, the vibration nearly knocking me off my feet. This was it. This was the proof. But how to show them? Then I saw it. Just to the side of the main grate was a smaller circular maintenance hatch, bolted shut. With numb, clumsy fingers, I managed to get a wrench on one of the bolts. It was frozen with rust. I put my whole body into it, the pressure in my head building. With a groan of tortured metal, the bolt turned, and then the next. As I worked on the final bolt, I felt a new, sharp vibration through the soles of my boots. Not the steady hum, but a series of quick, rhythmic shocks. Thump, thump, thump. The demolition crew. They were setting the preliminary charges. I was out of time. I gave the wrench one last, desperate heave. The bolt broke free. I pried the hatch open just a few inches. A torrent of water and a thick, fleshy tendril of that fibrous material shot out, wrapping itself around my arm. It didn't crush. It clung, cold and electric, and I felt a dizzying weakness wash over me, as if the strength were being pulled right out of my muscle. With my free hand, I drew my diver's knife and sawed at the thing. It parted with a texture like cutting through cold gristle. I shoved the severed piece, a thick, pale, pulsing length of the stuff, inside a canvas sample bag I had clipped to my belt. Then I slammed the hatch shut and gave 3 sharp tugs on my safety line, the signal to pull me up. The ascent, frantic, dizzying blur. I broke the surface, gasping, as Ben and Solomon hauled my heavy form over the side of the dory. They had the boat moving before my helmet was even off. We raced for the shore, the thump of the demolition charges growing louder and more frequent. We hit the dock running. Henderson and his crew were standing by the detonator box 100 yards from the dam. A crowd of townsfolk had gathered to watch. "Stop!" I yelled, my voice raw, stumbling towards them, still dripping water, and pulling the grotesque sample from my bag. "You don't know what you're doing!" I threw the thing on the ground at Henderson's feet. It lay on the dusty earth, a piece of pale, otherworldly flesh, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. It twitched, coiling and uncoiling like a dying snake. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Henderson stared at it, his condescending smile finally gone, replaced by a look of utter, horrified disbelief. "What in God's name is that?" he whispered. "That," Solomon said, his voice ringing out with the authority of a prophet, "is a piece of the dam's heart, and you're about to blow it to kingdom come." The world held its breath. The final warning siren began to wail across the water. Henderson looked from the pulsating thing on the ground to the impassive gray wall of the dam, and then at the terrified faces of my friends and neighbors. For the first time, the numbers and the blueprints had failed him. He was faced with a truth that couldn't be measured or calculated, a truth that had been pulled from the cold, dark heart of the river. He looked at his man by the detonator and, with a shaky hand, gave the signal to cut the power. The siren died, leaving behind a silence more profound than any I had ever known. We hadn't won. We'd just survived. The dam stood, its secret safe for now, the great heart inside still beating its slow, silent rhythm in the deep. The ocean and the rivers keep their secrets. If you've enjoyed this look into the depths, please subscribe to my channel. There are many more tides to turn and many more stories waiting beneath the surface.